Thank you for joining us for another episode of Lackawanna Pastimes as we celebrate the 158th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. We'll be joined today by Rich Smith, who will talk about the history and the origin of Gettysburg National Cemetery. Rich is a longtime resident of northeastern Pennsylvania and received his BSS from the Capital College, Penn State Harrisburg in 2001 and his master's from George Mason University in 2016. Currently, he's a PhD candidate at the Department of History at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, in the process of researching and writing a dissertation entitled Maryland Slavery, Maryland Freedom, Slavery and Independence in Revolutionary Era Maryland, 1760 to 1776. In 2009, Rich was an interpretive intern at Gettysburg National Military Park. His research interests, in addition to the American Civil War, include the interplay between slavery, politics, and society in both colonial America and the early United States. Rich, I'll turn the program over to you to talk about Gettysburg National Cemetery.
Thank you. As Sarah said in the introduction, I was at one point, was an interpretive intern at Gettysburg National Military Park, and one of the really fun things for me was being there during the anniversary and listening to you guys talk about it. Kind of brought back memories of that and about kind of having people come into the visitor center and asking where the reenactment is and all that. One of the interesting things about it too is that when I was there, the really neat thing about it was the anniversary when the battle actually took place. It fell on a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And when I was there, the anniversary of the battle fell on a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So that was really a thrilling experience for me. One of the programs that I did as an interpretive intern was a walking tour of the National Cemetery. Unfortunately, with COVID and everything else, we can't do that. So this kind of what I'm going to talk about is kind of basically an expanded version of that particular talk. I do apologize. As I said, I was going to have pictures, but my PowerPoint presentation for some reason does not want to work. And so I am going to just kind of go with what I have and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end of the program. With that out of the way, I'd like to get started. The National Soldiers Cemetery in Gettysburg is a portion of the battlefield, and what follows is going to be a brief outline of the history of the establishment of that cemetery and what it means. So, the Battle of Gettysburg itself was fought in July of 1863, as I'm sure you are well aware. The Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia fought bitterly over a 3-day period in and around the sleepy Pennsylvania town. Out of the approximately 163,000 people combined soldiers who met on the battlefield, approximately 3,100 Union soldiers and close to 4,000 Confederates were killed. 18,000 soldiers from Robert E's army were listed as wounded, including those who were mortally, and with approximately 5,000 missing. The Army of the Potomac under George Gordon Meade, of course, suffered almost 15,000 casualties, wounded, and 5,000 listed as missing. It is by far considered to be one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Most people talk about the war, what they don't talk about is the aftermath and what did the battlefield look like for those who unfortunately had to be present within the town after the battle took place. When the smoke and the cacophony of the battle cleared, Gettysburg and the surrounding terrain was indelibly transformed. To many citizens, it was the sights and smells were like their worst nightmares brought to life. Dead soldiers, dead horses, and shallow graves littered the grounds surrounding the Pennsylvania town. One citizen described it as no pen can paint the awful picture of desolation, devastation, and death that was presented here. Death in its ghastliest and most abhorrent forms are everywhere. Festering corpse lie at every step. It was a hideous and revolting sight. Another citizen described it this way, talking about Jacob Culp's Hill. Paper envelope, bits of paper, bits of letters, shreds of clothing, pieces of photographs, muskets, bayonets, ramrods, knapsacks, haversacks, caps, old shoes, and blankets, and many other articles were scattered. The trees are riddled with balls. One of the soldiers who participated in the battle, Amos Judson, also claimed that after the battle, he counted over 40 dead bodies within the circle of approximately 50 feet. They lay in every conceivable position among the rocks in that lowly, swampy ground. Some crouched behind the rocks as if about to fire, some lying upon their faces, and some stretched upon their backs like corpses laid out for a funeral, as if they had determined to observe the propriety of attitude even in the article of death. The rains had descended and the hot sun had beat down upon them, and they were now swollen and turned black. With mortification, and millions of maggots could be seen writhing upon their flesh. So it was a mess. It was a mess. It was a mess. One thing that the citizens also commented about, which I'd like to speak a little about, the grisly scenes that were before these people also brought hogs and insects to the area, and they ended up feasting upon the dead soldiers and horseflesh. John Wirt, who was traversing the battlefield in the aftermath, wrote that he witnessed several bodies that had swine were found reveling in the remains in a manner too horrible to contemplate. One soldier who was injured during the fight on July 2nd and remained on the battlefield that night recalled how he had the interesting experience of fending off hogs who were attempting to gorge themselves on him and a lifeless body that lay next to him. Another soldier convalescing in a field hospital near after the battle experienced the nightmare of watching hogs feast upon the pile of amputated limbs, one of which happened to be his own that had just been recently removed. In addition to the hogs, the flies came, and flies were everywhere. They appeared here in droves. John Campbell claimed that every fence and bush was black with flies. Mary Horner, another citizen, exclaimed that the flies exceeded them all. These winged insects arrived with the intent of laying their eggs on the mounds of rotting flesh. Once hatched, of course, the eggs would turn into larvae, and the larvae would feast upon the bodies of the dead and dying, and thereby aiding in their decomposition. The hot and humid summer weather only served to intensify the stench of death and rotting flesh. One resident wrote that when he opened his windows in the morning, he would be met with an odious smell. Some residents grew tolerant of this smell, others did not. And those who left could, or those who could leave did. Others, unfortunately, according to one witness, actually died from the stench of death. So it's a very, very powerful smell. One soldier, on burial duty, described it this way. He wrote that when burying soldiers, they would cover their faces tightly with our hands and turn our backs to the breeze and retch and grasp for breath. To ward off the smell, many Gettysburg residents wore handkerchiefs soaked in either peppermint or palm oil. One historian summed up the sights quite accurately, writing that the landscape was no doubt a raw, foul, and offensive setting, that which was both oppressive and unsettling to those who had occasion to traverse the storm, lashed streets and fields, trampled and broken meadows and woods, and the gouged and rutted hills, ridges, and knolls. So it quickly has become clear to the people in the town that something needs to be done. These soldiers need to be buried. One of the reasons, in addition to of course the stench and the flies and the hogs and just the appearance of them, one of the reasons they needed to bury them was that it was beginning to become close to farming season, planting season again, and these corpses that were laying on the field were in the way of farmers being able to harvest, to plant, and then eventually harvest their crops. In addition, those that were buried, some soldiers did bury their fallen comrades, and these graves were often shallow. And so when it rained, and it rained in the days after the battle, a lot of the dirt would be washed away. Whereas in other instances, hogs would be digging up the the buried soldiers and gnawing on the graves. Simple fact that they weren't buried very in a deep grave site. Reasons being because of circumstance and time constraints due to being in the army, and the army eventually leaving and going after Robert E. Lee in pursuit of the Army of Virginia. Another reason that people wanted to bury these bodies was because they feared the hordes of people that they feared were going to descend upon the town. Not just people looking for souvenirs, but sightseers, undertakers, embalmers, and those, of course, who are looking for their loved ones. One of the first attempts to bury the Gettysburg dead in a more secure and permanent grave is, of course, Elizabeth Moser Thorne, who was the wife of Peter Thorne, who was the caretaker of the Evergreen Cemetery, which is the private cemetery located in Gettysburg and actually was a part of the battle on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. During the battle, Thorne had fled. She had fled the battle, and she did not come back to her home, which was the now famous gatehouse outside at the entrance of the Evergreen Cemetery. And so she came back, and what she found approximately 105 dead Union soldiers in her cemetery. Headstones and tombstones were cracked. They were broken. They were chipped with bullet holes. Some of them were tipped over to act as barriers to prevent other soldiers from being shot. It was just, and there were several dead horses also littering this area. And Elizabeth Thorne and her elderly father basically set about the task of burying these soldiers and the horses. She ended up getting rid of 31 horses, and approximately 105 Union soldiers were reburied in the grounds. What makes her effort even all that more amazing is she is 6 months pregnant while doing this. And to the best of my knowledge, nothing happened to the child afterwards. It was born completely healthy and free. Peter Thorne, by the way, was in Virginia with the 183rd Pennsylvania. He was serving in the Union Army down in that area. There is in the Evergreen Cemetery today, I don't know if any of you have seen it. I've seen pictures of it. I have not had a chance to go and see it personally, but there is a statue dedicated to Elizabeth Thorne, and it serves as a startling reminder of the deeds that this woman accomplished in the July heat of 1863, and also as a testimony to her strength and her fortitude in the face of what must have seemed like daunting circumstances. While she is doing this, though, there in the town, there is also a sentiment growing within the town for some citizens of Gettysburg that these people gave the last full measure of devotion to their country and deserve to be recognized as such and have a final resting place where these soldiers, especially those from Pennsylvania, can go and be recognized for their sacrifice for the good of the nation. And so they begin petitioning Governor Curtin, the governor of Pennsylvania at the time, to set aside a portion of the battlefield where the Pennsylvania dead could be buried and be given a final resting place and a place of honor in the nation's topography. One of the first to do this, of course, is David McCawney. He is the president of the board of the Evergreen Cemetery, and he offers to bury all the Pennsylvania dead in the Evergreen Cemetery, and he wants Curtin and the state to foot the bill for this. And while Curtin is mulling that over, a relief agent from New York named Theodore Demon, he's a relief agent from New York, and he recognizes the impracticality, the unfeasibility of sending the rest of the soldiers, having Pennsylvania's dead buried in Pennsylvania, but sending the rest of the dead soldiers back to their families and their residences outside of Pennsylvania. And so he is one of the first ones to actually come up with the idea of making, instead of a Pennsylvania cemetery, let's make it a national cemetery. Let's make it a national cemetery where all the state's dead can be honored for, where all the dead from all the various states in the Union can be honored for their sacrifice of in defense of their country. So and one thing also Demon wanted was he wanted a section of the battlefield set aside for this purpose. So he gets this idea and he goes and he meets with David Wills, and David Wills is a Gettysburg lawyer, and organizer of the main impetus behind the National Cemetery. He meets with Wills, and he meets with the governors of the various other states in the Union, happen to be in the area at the time. And they all agree that it's a great idea to make it a national cemetery. Wills takes Demon's idea and he pitches it to Governor Curtin. Governor Curtin is extremely excited by this idea, and he writes back to Wills and gives Wills the go-ahead to go and do this. One of the first tasks, of course, is to find a particular and important piece of ground for the cemetery to be laid out. And Wills decides to do a section of the battlefield on Cemetery Hill, adjacent to the Evergreen Cemetery. The problem is that when David McConney had written to Governor Curtin with his proposal, while he's waiting for Curtin's answer to his inquiry, he went about making vocal contracts with people who own the land on Cemetery Hill for the purpose of expanding the Evergreen Cemetery to accommodate the large number of dead soldiers that will be that were going to be reinterred in there, according to his original plan. Wills had also selected the same site and went about trying to get the landowners who had made verbal contracts with McConney, trying to get them to kind of renege on their deal and promise to sell to him instead. And eventually a stalemate came through. There was some talk and negotiation on either side, and finally McConney agrees to sell the land to the state for the purpose of establishing a national cemetery. He sells the land at $175 per acre. So with the land in hand, Wills then goes about how to design the cemetery. And to design the cemetery, he chooses William Saunders. William Saunders, of course, at this time is an employee of the United States Department of Agriculture. Before that, he had designed cemeteries in the past. He designed gardens in the past. And in the future, he will be the one who designs Abraham Lincoln's tomb. So Saunders in accepting to design this task puts the utmost care into it. He designs a semicircle with simple headstones, and he lays them out arranged state by state, but he wants enlisted officers and the regular soldiers to be on equal footing. There is no distinguishing officers from enlisted men. They're all on an equal plane, and he thought that was important to kind of stress the idea that these soldiers shared equally in defending their country. The whole design was intended to convey the overwhelming solemnity and magnitude of the moment through simplistic grandeur. So that's what Saunders was aiming for in his design. I would say that, judging today, he more than accomplished that. In a private meeting with Abraham Lincoln on November 17th, Lincoln wholeheartedly endorsed Saunders' design. And so that kind of gave it the extra approval to go forward. In addition to getting somebody to design the cemetery, to purchasing the land, Wills also said about planning the consecration ceremony and selected October 23rd is selected as the original date. Wills had asked several individuals to come and give the oration. He finally asked Edward Everett. Edward Everett, of course, is the orator of the day. And Wills knows full well that giving his oration would lend a sense of legitimacy and a sense of credence and importance to the events of the consecration ceremony. However, Everett says that he will gladly accept the invitation, but he'd like to push the date up to November and not October, due to the fact that in addition to being ill, he also feels that he would not be able to make his prior speaking engagement and prepare an address that is adequate enough for the situation, for the events of and the grounds of the cemetery by October of 1863. And so Wills acquiesces and says, okay, and they move the date to November 19th. So with the date locked into place, Wills decides then now the next task on Will's list is to offer contracts. He offers contracts for transporting the dead from the battlefield to the cemetery. He places an ad in the paper in October the 15th, and he says that he will accept sealed bids until the 22nd. The 22nd of October comes, and by that time he had received 34 bids. They ranged in price from $8 per body to $1.59 per body. The lowest bid won, and it was given by a man by the name of Frank Biesecker. And Biesecker was the one who was charged with digging up the bodies and bringing them over to the new grounds. Biesecker hires Samuel Weaver as the individual responsible for identifying the bodies. He is the one who determines who the soldiers are, whether they're Union or Confederate, and he is also responsible for overseeing them being put into a coffin and taken to the burial grounds on Cemetery Hill. Weaver had a couple methods for identifying the dead bodies. When the body was first brought up from the ground, he would take an iron hook and he would go through the pockets looking for letters, diaries, pictures, anything that could help give him an idea of who this individual was and why he was, and where he might have been from. To determine whether he was a Union or a Confederate soldier, Weaver would use his clothing. Weaver would look at the clothing. He would look at the color and the type of the clothing. If he was a Confederate, Confederates usually wore cotton, dyed gray or a brownish gray. Union soldiers, on the other hand, wore blue. It was usually a blue wool. Usually used with the Union soldier uniform. What Weaver would then, if he couldn't tell if it was a Confederate or a Union, he basically would actually strip the body down to its undergarments. The undergarments were the final arbiter of determining whether it was a Union or Confederate soldier. Undergarments for a Confederate soldier were, of course, made of cotton. Undergarments for a Union soldier were, of course, wool. Weaver's system, of course, was not foolproof. And of course, there are approximately, I want to say, 5 Confederates who are buried in the Union in the Civil War section of the National Cemetery. The vast majority of bodies, of course, were unknown or their identity was undetermined. One of the reasons for this, of course, is that they didn't have any personal possessions on them that could identify the body when they were presented before Samuel Weaver. In addition, some soldiers did bury their former comrades, as I said. Some of the they would actually put wooden planks as headstones, but in the rains, a lot of them scribbled with pencil. In the rain, of course, the pencil would simply wash away, leaving a blank wooden plank. And of course, at that point, there was no way of determining who the soldier was. Once the bodies were placed in a casket, then they were transported to the National Cemetery and Cemetery Hill. Weaver, in turn, went about and hired a gentleman by the name of Basil Biggs. He is a veteran. He is a African American who emigrated to Gettysburg in the 1850s. He is the one who is actually responsible for digging up the bodies and bringing them to Weaver, and then placing them in the coffin and taking them to the National Cemetery for reburial. Once the bodies arrived at the cemetery, they were placed in specific rows, and they were, of course, dug by John Hoke and James Townsend. While this was going on, of course, the day for the consecration ceremony rapidly approached. November 7th, Wills writes to Lincoln, and he says to Lincoln, formally invites Lincoln to come and make a speech. You know, people have made light of Wills's comment about Lincoln offering a few appropriate remarks. However, and they have suggested that it was he really didn't want him to, he was an afterthought as far as speaking goes. That is not entirely true. The reason for that is Wills also included an insert in his letter offering Lincoln an opportunity to stay in his home with Wills in his home. And Lincoln, of course, actually, when Lincoln arrived on November 18th, he actually had a bedroom in Wills's house, further suggesting that he was not an afterthought. Lincoln was not an afterthought. Is that several other dignitaries who had showed up and stayed at Wills's house did not get the same treatment. They were expected to sleep on the floor. Andrew Curtin is a great example of that. He spent the night of November 18th on the floor of the David Wills house. November 19th broke. It was an unseasonably warm day. Lincoln, of course, makes his way to the ceremonies at the cemetery. Edward Everett speaks. He speaks for 2 hours. Basically, alludes to the Greek and Roman wars of the past. Compares the noble deeds of the dead Union soldiers with these soldiers of the past. And he also has a theme of do not forget the deeds of the dead here. And he basically says, do not let these soldiers have died in vain. Please continue on. Please continue on. Please, ultimate victory. Victory is the ultimate goal. If not, these soldiers have died in vain. Everett sits down, and then, of course, the band plays for a little bit, and then Lincoln speaks. Lincoln speaks for all of 6 or 7 minutes. Not even that. He is interrupted a few times by applause. And his speech, he not only said, you're very familiar with the Gettysburg Address. He not only said that, placing the war on a higher plane, on a new birth of freedom, meaning for Black and white Americans, and also too that he also stated that we must remember the efforts of these fallen soldiers. And again, like Everett, victory is the ultimate goal. If we do not achieve ultimate victory, if we do not defeat the Southerners, anything less will have meant that these dead have died in vain. But he, and he also says something else though, and this is where I will differ a little bit. He also spoke about remembering not just the dead during the war, but afterwards. He understood that the National Cemetery meant more than just remembering the dead in that time frame, but that these dead should always be remembered for their sacrifice, and also that what a sacrifice might be, people might be willing to make to further to ensure that the nation continues to endure long after Lincoln is, long after others that have been there have died, long after the guns have fallen short on the battlefield. And of course, after the ceremony is over, Lincoln goes back and he heads back to Washington. The speech itself is reviewed in various newspapers and political sides, whether you're Republican, they praised it. If Democratic newspaper trashed it, basically criticized it. Edward Everett perhaps had the best commentary on the speech itself. It basically took me 2 hours to say what you could have said in 2 minutes, setting the war in a greater context. After, of course, as the war concludes and Northern Southerners come to reunite, the cemetery, of course, eventually becomes incorporated as a national cemetery in 1872. And of course, it is now part of the Gettysburg National Military Park and is one of the highlights of the tours of that particular battlefield. In touring the cemetery, of course, you will come across the Soldiers National Monument, which was completed by 1869 and contains 5 marble statues: War, Peace, History, Plenty, and the Genius of Liberty. It is all located behind the semicircle of graves. One of my favorite monuments, and I'll end with this. One of my favorite monuments is a simple funeral urn. It's a marble funeral urn, and it is dedicated. It is perhaps one of the oldest, if not the oldest, monuments on the entire battlefield, and it is dedicated to the 1st Minnesota Regiment, who in July 2nd of 1863, a hole appeared in the Union lines, and William Scott Hancock, general in charge of the line at the time, needed to plug the hole, and he asked the 1st Minnesota to go in and plug that hole. They went in knowing full well that the vast majority of them were not going to come out alive. They suffered 82% casualties in that engagement. They suffered even more on July 3rd during Pickett's charge. And why I bring them up is, of course, to me, it's one of the ultimate reminders, the ultimate sacrifice. And I kind of thinking about, they gave the ultimate sacrifice that you and I and everybody else can enjoy the freedoms that we talk about, the freedoms that we care about, the freedoms that our founding fathers, especially as we celebrate Independence Day on July 4th, we talk about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and all that. Those men willingly gave up their lives for people that they were never going to meet, never cared to meet, would never meet in other circumstances. They never would meet you and I, but they were willing to give they were willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice so that we can enjoy the freedoms that we do. So if you walk through a cemetery and you see a soldier's grave, and kind of tip your hat to them and say, hey, thank you. As for the cemetery itself, it is still a very moving experience to go and see. It continues to flock to visitors every year and is a very popular attraction. And with that, I will conclude and be willing to take any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rich. That was an excellent presentation. I said I was in Gettysburg a few weeks ago, and as we were walking around, one of the things that we were kind of talking about and wondering about was what was it like after the battle was over. So I'm glad you, as grim as it was, I'm glad you covered that to see what happened immediately afterward. So if anybody has any questions, please chime in. I was muting people as we were going, so if you have any questions, please unmute yourselves and chime in.
Rich, I have a question.
Yes.
You said that there were 5 Confederates that they determined were buried there.
Yes.
How did they determine that after the fact? Do you know?
I do not know off the top of my head.
Okay.
I do know from research there are 5 of them. One probably, well, I do understand how they probably got in there was probably the Confederate had stolen some Union clothing and probably put it on, and that's probably how Weaver ended up misidentifying the body, and that's how it ended there. I do not know exactly how they determined they were Confederates, but I probably through researching the records, because Weaver kept very meticulous records of the names and bodies that he had brought over, and probably comparing them with muster rolls.
Okay.
I'm guessing because, well, for one example, there is an M. Knott that is listed in, it is buried in the cemetery from Maryland. And he is, of course, he is a Confederate soldier. And so what they ended up happening is they probably went and compared the muster rolls and realized that this person was not on the rolls of the various regiments at the time right before the battle took place. And I'm guessing that is the way that they determined how Confederates were buried there.
Thank you.
My guess is they had on the wrong underwear.
Yeah, probably. Probably.
I mean, that makes sense. Yeah.
That was a good detail. I like that. Charlie, did you have something to add too?
I just wanted to ask, I don't know what the sequence would be, but my sense of it is Gettysburg was the first national cemetery. Now there are a few others, I think at Antietam, a couple other places around the country. Is that the case? Wasn't Gettysburg the first national cemetery?
It was the first national cemetery, but up until that point there were other cemeteries that had honored dead soldiers, but I was the first one that was considered a national cemetery, and there were other ones established afterwards. I believe I want to say Vicksburg and Stones River was the 2 established afterwards. I don't know. I believe it was the first, but I don't know for certain. I don't want to say for sure.
So while most of the battlefields, some portion of it turned into a cemetery by necessity.
Yeah.
Gettysburg was the first, potentially the first, that was actually created as a deliberate memorial, and then later became national.
Yes. Yes, it was finally incorporated as a national cemetery in 1872.
Then all the rest of them followed, wherever there might be one.
Yeah. There's right now approximately, I want to say 130 national cemeteries currently.
Arlington is a pretty old one too, Charles.
That's Arlington.
Yes. Maryland was actually a border state, so their soldiers fought on both sides, for whatever that's worth. You know, they weren't an official southern state. They were a border state.
Well, it's funny. When I was an intern, I had a guy actually argue with me about the placement of the West Virginia cannons. And he claimed that the cannons were facing towards the southern lines, but he claimed that they were facing in the wrong direction. he said they should have been facing towards the northern lines because West Virginia was always a part of Virginia and will always be a part of Virginia and was not allowed to secede the way they did from Virginia. And, I kind of was just kind of, I just kind of sat there and I was like, okay. But, it's interesting. It's an interesting, it was just, for what it's worth, it's an interesting tidbit how involved the border states can be.
Yeah, Kentucky guys fought both ways. Missouri guys fought both ways. So,
And some Pennsylvanians that fought for the South.
Yeah.
yeah, there could have been two.
Pemberton, I think, was one.
Mr. Smith, I've walked that cemetery. I've done several walks through downtown Gettysburg. I've had people give us tours. No one ever mentioned the hogs. I'd never heard this before today.
Mention
And,
what?
the hogs.
Oh,
Yes.
I've never heard that before. Very interesting.
That's a detail that'll stick with you, Charlie.
It
Yeah,
will.
like all night.
Well,
In the night, in the middle of the night.
if you think about it, though, it makes sense because
I'll call you tomorrow if I didn't sleep.
if you think about it, it makes sense in the sense that there were several farms around that area and things were getting destroyed and farms fences were being torn down that probably kept these hogs in there and they were probably allowed to roam free and not having access to food. They just found whatever they're foragers and they found what they could find. And I just can't imagine laying there and seeing like an animal gnawing on your leg, that you just had cut off. It's just
Yummy.
it's an interesting it's an interesting experience all into itself.
It is.
I'm watching
vivid.
Mary
Yeah.
Ann making faces. I have a book and I have to find it when I can finally get up on a chair. And it's a whole book on the 6 months after Gettysburg.
Ah.
Oh.
And so, Mary Ann, if you're making these faces now, you'd be making faces forever.
I will be. I
You know.
will be.
I'd love to-
I think I'll skip that book.
I'd like to
Gotta find it now.
out the title of that book and get a copy of it.
Yeah, George, do you have the title off the top of your head by chance?
Off the top of the head, I don't. And I think the row of Civil War books behind a row of streetcar books, and they're kind of high up. And for those of you that don't know, I had surgery June 22nd, and I have some lifting and climbing and stretching restrictions for a while. But we'll get to them.
When you find the title,
If you think of it or you find it, let us
What I
know what
really
the title
need
is,
is
and
a
we'll send it
second
around.
floor in this room, but my wife isn't about to allow me to do that.
One of the books that I've had the pleasure of reading is a book by one of the park rangers at Gettysburg, Gregory Coco, who has since passed on. But his book, I actually have here too. It's called A Strange and Blighted Land, Gettysburg, the Aftermath. And it goes into great detail about the aftermath of the battle. It goes through all the carrying of the wounded, talks about the Confederate dead, talks about Union dead, talks about the cemetery. It really is a good book and highly recommended as far as the aftermath of the battle goes.
I asked Siri, who I go to for everything, the original national cemeteries. And the first one listed was Alexandria, Virginia. And it was established in 1862.
So that'd be Arlington.
And the third one listed is Antietam. And Gettysburg isn't listed until 14th.
wow.
Oh, wow.
So there must have been, a battle somewhere and then they buried them. And maybe they did it immediately. I don't know. But there's a whole long list of national cemeteries. I'm not sure what they define as a national cemetery, but Alexandria, where was the first Union death in the Civil War, maybe that determined what the national cemetery.
That was Robert E. Lee's property, and they started burying people there out of spite. That was the Curtis mentioned.
Yeah.
Yes, because wasn't it Montgomery Meigs' son killed?
Yeah.
I
the
believe.
colonel's- The
And
colonel
that's
was,
why he had them buried.
Colonel was Lincoln's buddy. He went
Yeah.
across the river to take down a Confederate flag.
That's right. And that was an
Owner shot
Alexander,
him. They shot the owner. He
right?
was literally the first casualty of the Civil War.
Mm,
Oh, that's interesting. 14. Wow. And it's the most famous.
Yeah.
Well, okay then. Before we conclude, if I can, Mary Ann, put a plug in. The Civil War Roundtable will meet at the Abington Memorial Library on September 21st. Anyone interested is invited. You can contact the library for specifics. And certainly, Mary Ann, you can share my email with whomever so we can pass that on. And
Charles, you said September.
yes,
Yeah,
well, we're going to meet in July and August, but it's going to be outside. In September,
Yeah.
we're going to be inside.
Okay.
I'm just thinking ahead for vacations and whatever. Anybody, certainly you're invited July 20th. August 17th, we're going to consider a trip to Elmira. September 21st, we're most likely going to be indoors because it was a close run last time between us and the rain.
Mm.
Charlie's video, and we won, but not by much.
Yeah, Charlie, if you
Charlie-
send me the schedule, we'll share it with everyone
Thank you.
so they have it. Thank you.
All right, then on that note, we'll wrap it up. Rich, thank you again for joining us, for sharing the history of Gettysburg National Cemetery. I said one of the things that we talked about when I was in Gettysburg a few weeks ago was just what had happened in between. So I'm really glad you included that in there. Otherwise, stay tuned, everyone, for our next program. Our next session of Lackawanna Pastimes will be on July 16th. We'll be joined by our very own George Gula, who's a longtime attendee of our programs. George will be giving a photo tour of the Northern Electric Trolley System that ran from Scranton into the Abingtons at the turn of the century. So that'll be our next program on July 16th. Otherwise, thank you again for joining us, and Rich for sharing your history. Everyone have a lovely weekend and happy 4th of July.